So I've received some pushback for hosting this discussion between myself and the leader of the National Rebirth Party, Alek Yerbury. I don't know if that's the way to pronounce your surname.
Yerbury.
Yerbury. Apologies for butchering that. He's reached out to me on Twitter, quite interested in my Twitter post, saying that communists are better use their time talking to workers at the remigration process in Nuneaton than in the liberal gangbang that was Together in London, with some pretty disgusting scenes by the Green Party. It raises questions: who is the real working class in this country? Alek and I had a good conversation about that. We talked about things that we disagreed on, some surprising things that we agreed on, some surprising terrain of common ground. So I would like to share this conversation with you guys. So we're going to have a talk about Yerbury's view on the third position, in contrast with my views on Marxism-Leninism. Maybe talk about some common ground in terms of the necessity of a stronger planned economy in Britain. We'll talk about foreign policy, the Zionist influence in Britain. It's going to be an open conversation. A lot of it's going to be shooting the shit, but that's what you guys quite like. So we'll be doing that. So please welcome Yerbury, in spite of whatever agreements or disagreements you may have. So let's roll the intro and get started. So that was our intro to our commie media channel. Even though it's communist, what are your honest opinions as a nationalist leader in Britain?
Well, look, firstly, thank you for inviting me on the show. I don't believe that politically people should exist in echo chambers or should exist in a bubble. And I think that more effort does need to be made for people who maybe understand that there is something deeply wrong with the current system and are looking for an alternative. I think those people should actually be talking to each other more, even if they don't necessarily immediately agree, simply because they are the people who understand that there is something wrong with the current order. So thank you for inviting me on the show, and I hope it will be a pleasant enough discussion, regardless of whether we agree or disagree. It seems like you've got a good show here and a good audience of people, and be looking forward to hearing your perspective on things as well. I mean, I don't know if you want to ask me a specific question or you want me to give my sort of general view on the political.
Well, I definitely want to dig into your views on third positionism, as it was actually these ideas that I personally subscribe to. Sorry, so this is a bit of a reveal here, but I personally subscribe to probably at the age of 17. I read quite a bit into the third position. In the end, Marxism-Leninism, as practiced by Joseph Stalin and Chairman Mao, really won me over. You can see my portrait of Lavrenti Beria next to me. You could always ask me about that. So this is a two-way conversation. I'm also welcome to hearing some of your questions about my beliefs, as I believe if we are to have this conversation, both of our belief systems need to be interrogated.
Fair enough.
So yeah, I mean, I was inspired to actually have you on because the podcasts lately that intrigued me the most are Jake Shields' podcast with members of the ACP, as well as Patriotic Front in America, and also the American Communist Party. ACP is the abbreviation for that. And also, it was Dilly Hussein's interview with Nick Griffin, and
I saw this.
yeah, and Mark Collette. And it fascinated me because Michael Gove opened up his campaign against extremism in Parliament, and he cited two main camps. He cited Islamists, and he cited ethnic nationalists in Britain. With patriotic alternative. I mean, I understand you've established your party a little bit after that. So, actually, that'll be a good thing. Would you like to describe your political history? Because I think I might have seen you in person in Cannock on the big patriotic alternative march. I was there. I was actually on the other side as I was with my union Acorn when I was still around there. But I'd like to understand your political history a little bit.
Yeah, of course. So, firstly, you wouldn't have seen me at Cannock because I had as I did spend some time in 2021. I tell you what, I'll go back. So, before I became active in politics, which was at the back end of 2021, I was in the British Army, and I was in the army between 2015 and 2021. And my primary reason for leaving the army, don't get me wrong, I did good things there, and I think I got good skills out of it, and I enjoyed living in that collectivized military environment. And I very much believed that I as a man had a duty to actually contribute to the protection of the country that I profess to care about. Therefore, I had an obligation to do that, and that's how I felt. But my main reason for leaving was my disgust with the political direction of Britain. And so, therefore, having put my money where my mouth was, the time was to move on, which I did. And so it was the end of 2021 that I became politically active, pretty much as soon as I left. Okay. The first political group that I engaged with was Patriotic Alternative, and that was towards the end of 2021. And I did work for them until beginning of 2023, whereupon I left. Now, I'll elaborate onto why in a minute, but throughout 2023 and early 2024, I spent a lot of my time going up and down the country, going to or trying to organize various demonstrations, mostly to do with immigration related issues. And the reason I did that is because I felt that there was a lot of anger there, not just to do with immigration, but there was a lot of anger at the political system and the decisions being made, but it wasn't able to be harnessed or organized in any useful way. Now, I spent a year trying to do that, and the conclusion that I came to was that attempting to turn that kind of street activism into viable politics was never going to work. The only thing that was going to work was not just to agitate against the system, but to actually offer something better to replace it with. Because if you couldn't do that, then agitating became pointless, which then led me to the beginning of 2024, where myself and a few others, we put together the National Rebirth Party. We launched it with its political program in place from the day it launched. And we've spent the last 2 years putting in place a branch structure and a branch organization, and slowly getting people out of a lot of the echo chambers and out of especially the online environment, and actually into the real world where they're talking to real people. So in terms of why I think that what I'm doing now is better than the things I did previously, so from 2021 to 23, I think because there is actually a goal. One of my biggest concerns and problems with Patriotic Alternative was that there was no real coherent belief system, despite what the spokespeople would say. There was no real belief system or ideological aim to any of it, besides they didn't like the government and they didn't like immigration. And whilst I could sympathize with that, I also knew that that is not actually a foundation for any kind of genuine change. It becomes, as someone in my own party described in a speech when they were talking about reform, it's a grievance engine. It's not actually a vehicle for change.
Sorry,
And
so
so,
this is, sorry to interrupt. So this is patriotic alternative,
yes,
right?
it was just a grievance engine.
I mean,
Um,
did patriotic alternative not have a you know, for want of a better term, a national socialist vanguard? Did patriotic alternative, did they not have like an esoteric component of their organization? Because they did quite well to do a lot of outreach in communities very badly affected by basically putting up a whole bunch of migrants up in hotels, and they won a lot of public support for that. You know, that was their exoteric engine, but did they not have that esoteric component in where they inculcated the most active and most dependable members of that organization with like a higher level of like ideological teachings of National Socialism?
so there were people in there who did have those ideological beliefs,
Mm,
but by and large, the majority of the people in that organization, and I'm not saying they were bad people, but the majority of people were simply driven by a dislike of the government and a dislike of immigrants or a dislike of Jews. And
mm,
to me, that's not an ideology. That's just you don't like something. If you were to ever talk about things like the economy or how society should function, how the government should function, you would struggle to get a coherent answer. It basically differed depending on who you talk to. And one of the things that then we've made a point of doing with the NRP is we do have to have that coherent ideology in place. That you can't just have a piecemeal wish list of things that you want and think that that's going to be good enough, because people can't do anything with that. So I
mm.
think that's the problem with something like PA, and also the fact that, in my opinion, that kind of activism unintentionally just acts like a form of containment for the people doing it, where it traps them in this state where they're just repeating the same noise making activities over and over again. And not only does it not actually fix the problem, but the whole time that's going on, the problem actually gets worse. And when you start to realize that, and you start to realize it doesn't actually work, in the exact same way as there are people who have tagged along to Tommy Robinson events for 20 years, and I've got no love for Tommy Robinson, but there's people who have tagged along to Tommy Robinson events for 20 years because they honestly believe that by going to a Tommy Robinson rally, they are somehow going to get rid of grooming gangs, which is never going to happen by going to a Tommy Robinson rally. And
Mm.
it's the same principle where making a lot of noise doesn't actually equate to a result.
Yeah, so that's interesting to hear about your experience in Patriotic Alternative. As I mean, I saw your debate with Mark Collette on UNN, hosted by our mutual friend David Clues. That was a very interesting watch. So I want to sort of scratch down in your and your organization's vision for Britain. So would it be fair then to call your organization, National Rebirth, an ethnic nationalist party?
I think that would be fair
Mm,
in that, yes, it is a third position nationalist party, but we do ultimately advocate a form of ethnocentric nationalism.
mm,
I wouldn't think it's fair to describe it. I know some people would describe it as white nationalism, which is incorrect, because British people are actually their own ethnic group. But I think that, yeah, you could fairly describe it as a form of ethnocentric nationalism.
But then I would say that, say, the ethnic British people are a subsection of what would commonly be understood as the white race, insofar as there is such a thing. As I know, it's a very crude way to compartmentalize racial groups. Um, but then that would still be white nationalists, because you know, you're advocating the exclusive rights of a subgroup group of what would commonly be understood as a white race?
Well, I guess the way I could sort of explain this is not all white people are ethnically British. Um,
Mm.
Whereas people who are ethnically British, one of the qualities that an ethnically British person would have is white skin, but race is not as basic as that. Race and
Yeah,
ethnicity
no, I
are
get
much
that.
deeper
Yeah,
than that, and I don't think either of us would pretend otherwise. It's not just the color of somebody's skin. That is an Americanism, and I think a lot of British nationalism, especially ethnic nationalism, has suffered badly from importing 1950s American South forms of ethnic relations. But I think that we have to recognise that there is some deeper connection that British people have to the country that they're in, which people can only get through an enormous amount of time and through this shared collective ethnic heritage. I think maybe though one of the differences between our party and our interpretation of nationalism in this regard and what a lot of other nationalist parties or parties that call themselves nationalist parties in Britain would be is that what most other, if not all other nationalist parties in Britain are, is ultimately racist liberals, where they still fundamentally believe in neoliberal capitalism. They still fundamentally believe in the same political system we have now. They just want to live in a country that doesn't have any immigrants in it. And there's various reasons why that is stupid. But I think that's maybe the difference between our party and a lot of those parties when it comes to ethnic and race relations, is that we don't look at it from almost this racial NIMBYist point of view. We recognize that actually, people do have this racial and ethnic connection with people who are like them, and all people do have a place in the world and do belong somewhere and do belong with their own kin. It doesn't mean anybody is better or worse than anybody else, but it's just that all people do belong somewhere, and British people belong here.
And what would you say then about immigrant communities? So obviously you have the ethnic Pakistani community, ethnic Black communities in Britain. I mean, so what would a national rebirth party's policy be on those communities?
So firstly, I think we have to understand why those communities are here in the first place. And the reality is that many of those communities are here because of things which the British government did to either bring them here or through its foreign policy made life in their own ethnic homeland so untenable that they had no choice but to come here, or they felt they had no choice but to come here. I think that in the long term, one of the goals that there has to be is to create an ethnically homogenous society, or as homogenous as you can reasonably achieve. You're never going to live in a society that is totally homogenous. I mean, the only country on earth that you could describe as being like that is North Korea. But you're never going to have that. But as a general rule, the more homogenous your society is, the more stable its culture will be, the more stable its government will be, and the more stable its society will be. Therefore, it is an ideal that you have to pursue. I think that a lot could be done to actually get many of these people to want to be in their own ethnic homelands and to want to be amongst their own people by actually addressing the problems and the issues that caused them to come here in the first place.
Well, you have. Well, I mean, I personally am not convinced by the evidence that ethnic homogeneity is the ultimate barometer of social stability. Right, you have lots of countries in Africa that are fundamentally ethnically homogenous in that they're primarily African, and you still have a lot of conflict. Even in Britain, when it was largely ethnically homogenous, I mean, that was when class warfare was really at the helm of British society. That was the height of the trade union movement. That was the height of the Peterloo massacre, the Chartists. I mean, what would your analysis be of that?
I don't disagree that there are other factors at play beyond just that. I just see it as that factor, it makes it easier to control all those other factors. And I think also there is an almost spiritual element to it where people have this unconscious connection to people who are like them. And if you think a civilization is spawned when enough people who are genetically similar enough are in the same place at the same time, that their minds think in the same way, that then results in a civilization materializing, which is why when you create a totally heterogeneous mass of people, a totally racially diverse mass of people, whether you want it to or not, it struggles to actually produce a coherent civilization because people are so different, they think differently, they act differently, and so therefore they can't do that. And so that's where I think there has to be this desire to try and homogenize a country as much as can be done. But I do accept that there are other factors at play. As you said, when you had things like Chartist, Peterloo, etc. This was when Britain was a totally ethnically homogenous country. And there are, those economic factors do absolutely exist. And again, perhaps this is where my belief system and a party like ours is much different from what you would typically get if you were to type in a Google search and look at a nationalist party and look at it, because a lot of them will basically tell you that turning the clock back in Britain 70 years would somehow fix all of their problems, which it never would, because a lot of the problems they've got today are actually a consequence of things that were done 60 or 70 years ago. And so I think that, yes, those other factors do exist, but it's one of those situations where if you can't control the racial and the demographic factor, you will never be able to control those other factors. Those other factors will constantly be an issue. Whereas if you can control the homogeneity factor, you then have more ability to control everything else because you're able to stabilize society, economically and socially and politically. But you could never fix a society simply by making it ethnically homogenous. I would agree with that. You couldn't do that.
But that kind of contradicts your original point, because you say that that ethnic homogeneity is the pivotal factor that is of the primary influence, and tell me if I've quoted you wrong, is the primary influence of all the other factors. So that would kind of assume that the other factors would fall in line by default. I would also say that that contradicts the experience of Russia, China, Iran, three countries that are very socially functional. Obviously, with Iran, it's under siege, so that would be an exception to its to the trajectory of its existence. We have China and Iran that are socially harmonious, that are functioning very well, and that are actually some of the safest countries you could ever visit. But they're not; they cannot be described as ethnically homogenous, especially not Russia.
No, so on your first point, I don't think there is a contradiction there. The point I'm ultimately making is that it is a foundational factor that needs to be in place in order to then be able to control all the other factors. But I don't think that means the other factors don't matter. You still have to control all of the economic and the social and political factors as well beyond that. The point I'm kind of getting at is that a homogenous society on its own is not enough. That is not enough to produce a functioning society. Whilst it will produce this spiritual and ideological and this civilizational coherence, that still requires an understanding of economic, society, and politics, and it still requires a development of those things in order to work. As to what you said about China and Russia and Iran, yes, Russia is not a homogenous country, and despite what a lot of people I think in the West think that Russia is this overwhelmingly white European country, it isn't. Russia is a racially and ethnically diverse country. I think the reason why Russia is so stable, despite that situation, is because Russia has always functioned as an autocratic empire. It always has. You go back to Kiev and Rus, and then the Russian Tsarist Empire, and then even if you look at the time of the Soviet Union, it was still very autocratic. I think without some degree of autocracy.
What do you mean by autocratic?
I mean where you have a highly centralized governing power that is virtually omnipotent with regards to the whole rest of the population. So you have a highly centralized, powerful government, which I think Russia always has had. I think that's just always been a feature of Russia.
Is that not the experience of the vast majority of countries in the world, that they do enact a centralized authority that is the monopoly of that authority? And if you look at the Tsar, you can't really say that was an autocracy that acted omnipotently. I mean, after all, how would Lenin and the Bolsheviks would have actually built dual power if the Tsar was as powerful as you make him out to be? The Tsardom almost fell in 1905.
Yes,
it fell in February 1917, and then you had the provisional government, and then that fell. So, but again, that's true with most countries. They have centralized states, centralized authorities, and they were subject to change, reform, revolution. I'm not entirely convinced that Russia has in this Russian exceptionalism, in that they enjoy this unique autocracy that's omnipotent. It's almost like how the Western press paints Russia. That's the myth of Russia. But actually, we see that with most countries in the world.
I think it has historically been the norm. I think that when you look at, for example, Western Europe coming into the 1800s, I think government slowly became decentralized in a way that government in Russia never did. Government in Russia was still very centrally directed, from everything I've read and understand anyway, even in the days of the Russian Tsar. And just to clarify, by no means am I implying that Tsarist Russia was good. I think Tsarist Russia was terrible. And from the perspective of communism, I can absolutely understand why the average Russian decided that communism was a better option than what they had under the Russian Tsar.
So that's quite interesting. And look, I'm not interrupting to try and derail you or to gotcha or whatever. I just want to understand your position. But I would like to interrupt with this question. Do you think then that the Bolshevik Revolution and communism was a Jewish conspiracy?
I don't think it was something that was actually created by Jews. I don't think that Bolshevism and communism were created as a Jewish conspiracy. I think it was something which certain Jewish people, particularly Zionists, saw as a way of achieving their own objectives. And I think that there were definitely elements within the Zionist sphere globally who latched on to things that were happening in Russia for their own benefit. But I don't think that it was something which they created themselves, because people in Russia were deeply miserable anyway. They lived in a country where 99% of the population had virtually nothing and had no prospect of ever obtaining anything. And so I don't believe that, but basically, I think the Russian Revolution would have happened regardless in some form. I just think that there were certain elements of the Jewish lobby who saw it as a means to their own objectives in some way and latched onto it.
Well, there was a huge split, because I mean, the idea of like a Jewish lobby that comes with, that's really part of the Zionists. They were the upholders of Jewish separatism, whereas you had the Bundists who wanted Jews to live peacefully within the countries that they inhabited. Now, they were victimized very heavily under Saddam, but they knew that their salvation lies through the class struggle, and that was their vision for Jewish emancipation, whereas the Zionists wanted a separate Jewish state, um, as what we see today, a state that's parochial, that's hostile to all its neighbors. Um, but and that's why, in my view, the Soviet Union was from its inception anti-Zionist, and even if the Zionists saw an opportunity to exert their interest through the fall of Saddam, it didn't really work out for them. Especially as Stalin purged the Zionists, Lenin purged the Zionists, and the USSR turned very hostile against Israel and saw it as what it was. It was an outpost of American imperialism. But I want to put a pin in that for now. I think we should take some audience questions. What is your opinion on national action?
So I think that what national action ultimately was, and I'm going to use the same term again, which was just a grievance engine. I understand what the grievances, the kinds of people who supported it had, and I understand why they were as angry as they were, particularly with the government. But I think that in practice, it wasn't really much different from just organized or slightly more organized hooliganism. It was almost, to me, I mean, bear in mind, it's not something I was ever involved in or had any interaction with, because this was prior to my political involvement in anything. But when I look back at it and I read about it and I hear about it, it seems to me it's more like anarchism than anything else, like racialized anarchism.
Mm. I would agree with that. I think it was ultimately anarchism and adventurism that brought about their downfall. Um, they never really struck me as a particularly serious organization.
No.
I think it was. It's like, I think it was just raw, unbridled hatred. I think there's also a lot of weird shit about it. I think Nick Griffin published an interesting information piece. Whatever you think of him, it was quite interesting to dig into some of the really weird occultist shit that was going on with National Action, Order of the Nine Angles. That really, you had a bunch of sexual perverts in that organization using all sorts of weird occultist mental gymnastics to justify their pedophilia.
I
Um,
think with an organization like that, um, I would agree that it was fundamentally an organization which was motivated more by hatred of anything than actually
mm,
belief in anything. But I think that you do see that a lot now, and it's primarily within the realms of uh, hardcore nationalists, or what you would call the classic far right, that tend to produce these organizations which, at surface level, you might think that they have some sort of ideological meaning behind them, but actually a lot of it is just completely nihilistic anarchism, and it is just they hate the government, they hate immigrants, they hate the economy, they hate this, that, whatever. But it's like they've got no idea what they actually want. They've got no idea. If they hate the current system, they couldn't tell you what they want to replace it with. It is just complete anger, and it's as happened with national action, that then results in people just lashing out at absolutely everybody or anybody that happens to be near them, that happens to be easy to blame. And as a consequence, those people basically just become like political pirates where they're just enemies of everybody and nobody wants to deal with them. It's not productive. And I know Nick Griffin. I have spoken to him a couple of times on the telephone. It was only years ago. It wasn't recently. I haven't sort of engaged with him in a few years, but I know he was very hostile to it, and I can understand why.
Yeah, I think you see that with a lot of ultra leftist cliques as well. Groups that fetishize violence, death, and very, very radical, out of the ordinary policies that are just totally divorced from the ordinary day-to-day lives of people. And it's, as you say, it's a grievance engine. I think you see that on both sides. Anyway, let's get back to our. Sorry, do you want to just quickly come in on
No,
that?
I was going to say I think that a lot of these groups have kind of only come into existence in the way that the scale that they have because of the internet and because with the advent of social media and the internet, it becomes very easy for people to create these online echo chambers where they're not talking to their neighbors, they're not talking to people they work with, they're not talking to people they see in the street. They're just only talking to the people that happen to politically agree with them online. And a lot of the time, they're people they rarely ever see. And I think it becomes very easy for people to then end up in this environment where it's totally separate from normal society and everybody just reinforces everybody's most outrageous ideas. I mean, I would suggest other examples of it are things like the sort of incel
Mm, mm,
manosphere type movement. But yeah, I
mm.
think the sort of far right, far left, it has kind of become like that.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. I think let's get back to our
No worries.
conversation between us, and we'll just take comments as they go along. I hope you're enjoying the flow of this
Yeah,
conversation.
it's good, and it's like I said,
Good.
it's nice not to talk to an echo chamber.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, just back on the subjects of the Bolshevik Revolution. How would you summarize your views on the Bolshevik Revolution?
I would say honestly that regardless of the fact that in the 1920s and the 1930s it manifested in some absolutely terrible things that caused misery to huge numbers of people, I can totally understand why at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution the average Russian would have genuinely been happy about it taking place, because at the end of the day, prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, the average Russian had absolutely nothing. I think the literacy rate was something like 25%. Most people had no prospects. Anybody that did have work got very little for it. People were bled dry effectively by the landlord and the taxman. And when you look at when you look at good things that the rise of communism did in Russia, it industrialized a country that was socially centuries behind the rest of Europe. For instance, serfdom wasn't even abolished in Russia until the 1800s. It gave people work, it gave people homes, it gave people things like public health care, public education. People learned to read and write, and it's impossible to say that that is bad. And so I think that
Mm.
Russia moved forward because of the Bolshevik Revolution. Regardless of whether everything that happened was good, it did move forward.
Well, and it wasn't just Russia too. It was the Baltic states. It was the Balkans. It was really everywhere it touched. Mongolia, Central Asian republics. Eventually China. I don't know if you have a similar view on the communist revolution in China. So, how do you then square the positives that you very correctly, and I appreciate you for acknowledging those? How do you square those with your view that that the Bolshevik Revolution ended up leading to a lot of human misery and suffering?
I think because one of the things about communism and that kind of communism is it only helps people when they are in such a state that they have very little to nothing to lose. We're talking outright communism or Bolshevism. When people, for example, do when you do have, for example, a middle class population where people aren't dirt poor, where a lot of people do own things, they don't, even if they don't own much, they do own things. Like, for example, at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, if you look at Western Europe, people in France, Germany, Britain, yeah, a lot of people still had very little, but they had more than what the average Russian peasant had. The same as in China, they had more than what the average Chinese peasant had. I think that when your society is effectively medieval in its organization, then outright Bolshevism is the better option. But I think when you have an industrialized society whereupon people are not all dirt poor, I think that kind of Bolshevism then becomes a burden rather than a help. And I think that that's what happened in some of the 1920s and 30s in Russia, for example, where you had like the famines in Ukraine. And I think that that is what happened when Russia had improved, or the Soviet sphere had improved as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution in some regards. But rather than the ideology move with the times, I think that they still tried to impose that same way of thinking even after it was past its time, and even after Russia had caught up and started to move on. So I think that's why it resulted in those sort of perverse outcomes. I think if they'd have moved it with the times more, that wouldn't necessarily have happened. But I do think it was right to be a fundamentally collectivist society in some way.
So there's some three things that I wanted to bring up with you. I think first is the claim of communism being appealing to people living under medieval or semi-feudal conditions. Two would be allegations of the Ukrainian famine, as I'm a heavy disputer of the narrative of the Holodomor. And three are your notions on collectivism, particularly because you identify that as some potential common ground between myself and you. So you claim that communism is fundamentally more appealing to people who live under medieval and semi-feudal conditions. I don't think that accurately reflects the experience of the Russian Revolution. Like, you had very heavy industrial centers in Moscow and Petrograd, Rostov-on-Don, and other places, Nizhny Novgorod, under the Tsar. And it was those were actually the hotbeds of Bolshevik circles. In fact, the Bolsheviks actually couldn't really get a strong hold in any parts of the vast majority of the countryside in Russia. And that's why they needed to establish a coalition with the socialist revolutionaries, who did have a strong base amongst the peasantry to actually push forward with the revolution. But, Bolshevism was strongest in the cities, and actually the revolution itself was strongest in the cities. That's how the Bolsheviks were able to decapitate the provisional government. It was by mobilizing soldiers and workers' committees in those cities to eventually seize power. And even in that time, communist parties were strongest in industrial France, Britain, Germany. Obviously, Germany was only brought to fascism under Hitler because it was under the precipice of a communist revolution. Capitalism was in crisis in Germany. So how do you square that with your claim that communism is primarily attractive to people living under semi-feudal conditions? Because it's industrialized workers historically and unionized workers that have turned to communism.
So I would say that it's not just about whether somebody is living under economically medieval conditions, but it's more to do with social organization and people's perception of the amount of power or influence they have. I can see, like, for instance, in the case of Russia, the average Russian peasant was completely disenfranchised. The average Russian worker was completely disenfranchised. Their only path to any kind of representation or public service was through something like Bolshevism at that time. I think that the appeal was that when you're living in a socially medieval condition, I think that's when the appeal of communism comes in. And like with England and France, you had organizations like trade unions. And I've got my own views on what trade unionism has become, but you had organizations like trade unions, people in who were sort of the working masses at the time. They did have those avenues or those outlets available that they could use, whereas in Russia, and the same, I would say, within China, those people had no outlet. I think it could be compared to, if you go back to the late 18th century and you look at the French Revolution, I think it could be compared to the way that the average French person had absolutely no mechanism for any sort of political power or agency within the direction of society. So I don't think it's necessarily about whether someone is economically deprived. It's their perception of whether, regardless of how economically well off they are, do they have any mechanism to ever improve their quality of life on their own? Or is their only mechanism to improve it by taking it by force? And I think that's probably why you had these sort of Bolshevik uprisings, or why they had their stronger support base in those cities, is because even though people you could say they might have been better off in some ways than a peasant in the countryside who can't even like read and write, they also had very little autonomy. And maybe a peasant in the Russian countryside felt that their way of life was more stable, even if it was poorer, whereas a worker in a city who's working in a factory might feel that their life is so unstable and so dependent on the whims of somebody else that they needed some way of having that agency and having that control over what was going on. That's how I would like mentally argue that.
So so you mentioned the fact that workers, let's just say workers in Western countries, and our mechanisms to improve, our conditions, pay, working hours, whatever. I'd personally argue that the most obvious mechanism that we have right now are trade unions. I mean, I read your party's manifesto, but just for the benefit of our audience, what is your view on unions and your party's view on unions?
So our party's intention with unions is we believe that trade unionism, i.e. third-party trade unionism, should be brought to an end. And in fact, all forms of trade union should be amalgamated into a state-sanctioned entity, and effectively that the government should take over the role of the protection of the worker and should act as that arbiter between the working man and the businessman and the entrepreneur, rather than outsourcing it to a third-party organization. Now,
but who controls the state?
Well, the people as a whole control the state. So in effect, the worker is then speaking for himself through the state. And I'll tell you why I think the reason why I think this is necessary. The reason I think it's necessary is because what I think has happened to trade unionism over the last, I would say over the last century, but I'd say it's predominantly happened since the 1970s. And especially since Margaret Thatcher, is what has happened is that trade unionism has almost become like an industry to itself. And whilst I understand that from the perspective of a person in a union, something like going on strike is a way of improving their pay or improving their conditions. I think the problem you've got now is that 100 years ago, the reason why working conditions were poor was often because people who owned businesses or people who had the money simply didn't want to use it to actually help the working man because they wanted to extract as much profit as they could. I think the problem now, though, is different. I think the problem facing people now and facing the working masses now, particularly like the unionized aspect of the working population, is that it's not so much that the money is hoarded and that the wealth is hoarded. It's that the wealth actually isn't there because the system itself is completely broken. And so, for example, now when people are going on strike, it's not necessarily going to help them in the long term because if they say they want more pay, like for instance, there's a doctor's strike this week and they want more pay, if the pay isn't there and the state cannot generate the wealth to pay them through the economic system that it has, there is no option there other than changing the economic system, which the trade union cannot necessarily do. And so I think that the
We could
reason
take
why
away the tens of billions that are being sent over to Ukraine, for instance.
we could, but that still doesn't change the neoliberal capitalist economic framework that is leading that to happen. Like I
That's
would
true.
argue,
It's a start. It's like an agitational point. There are some
yeah,
few
like
things that I want to take you up on, but please go ahead.
I was going to say, I would argue that the reason why we have to change the way that organized working people interact with the state is because without the state actually acting as that arbiter, and with when you've got this system at the moment, it's like a three-way system where you have the worker, you have the entrepreneur, and you have the government, and all three of these entities constantly end up fighting each other, and that isn't necessarily sustainable anymore. And I think the only way that you can actually produce a workable outcome where you have this improvement in quality of life or this feeling of fairness or genuine representation is for the working man to be able to represent himself using the state as his tool, as his mechanism of power. And I think the only way to do that is for trade unions not to exist as these third party entities, but to actually be absorbed as functions of the state that actually have some kind of state power behind them.
But trade unions exist precisely because workers do not see them at the state as a mechanism to improve pay terms and conditions. Trade union membership is totally voluntary, and the leaders of trade unions are also elected. So I'm not entirely convinced by your argument that workers can just use the state to advocate for their own interests after we basically cull the independent voice of unions. You're silencing workers on one hand, whilst offering them in my view, an illusory path to use the state as a mechanism by which to advance their interests. I just don't find that a coherent line of argument.
Well, my argument would be that the worker, through his ability to actually vote and uphold confidence in the government, can actually determine the course of government, especially when they exercise that power collectively. And so I would argue that actually the working man would then still have that representation. He would just have that representation in government.
Doesn't that make you a liberal, though?
Well, no, because I think in order to be a liberal, somebody has to fundamentally believe in individualism.
No, but what the argument you're giving is fundamentally a liberal argument. You're arguing that our parliamentary elected leadership enjoys legitimacy in governing the country because it is elected by the concept of the people, glossing over the class distinctions. It's a people made out of exploiters and the exploited. And my view, and this is my problem with third positionism, is that on the very pretense of transcending class divisions, you're simply just taking the side of the exploiters and the state run by the exploiters, against the exploited and the workers. Whereas my side, I'm unequivocal. There is a class war going on in Britain. It can't be done away with by decree, by a fascist decree, saying that, right, the businessman, the state, workers, we just need to all work together. It ignores the reality that there is a class struggle going on, that there are class antagonisms, and the way to do that is actually to side on the side of the working class, to eliminate those class antagonisms, and that's how you achieve real social harmony, not through ethnic homogenization, but actually through drawing to the conclusion of the class war. Anything other than that is liberalism, and that's why third positionism actually mirrors third way politics by Tony Blair. I mean, I'm surprised Tony Blair didn't try to dress it up, because third positionism and the third way are exact parallels. The latter, the liberal latter only has nicer window dressing than fascism. It's advertising, cooperatism. So you have the economic policies of Obama that mirror exactly the policies of Mussolini through the Institute of reindustrialization. That you use public money to prop up failed banks, failed businesses, protecting the wealthy, the businessman, at the detriment of the worker. You raid public coffers, you raid social services, you raid workers' pay terms and conditions to protect and keep afloat profits.
I mean, see, I would argue that there is this, that you fundamentally do have these two castes of people. You do have working people, and then you do have parasitic people. I think maybe where I might differ from your view, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that I do see that the businessman, the entrepreneur, the industrialist, these people, they do have a function. And whilst sometimes these people do exploit others, they do actually have a function. And quite often, what they actually do is just a form of work. It's a form of organization.
What is the function?
Work. The function is that they organize and administer. If you're, for example,
cannot a state do that?
The state can do that, but I think that you have to offer people a mechanism where people can be productive in their own right. And if somebody is capable of carrying out those functions, then that person should have every right to do those functions and to be productive in their own right. I mean, I think there is a line.
But that's absolutely right. That's why we have managers. Right. I work for the railway, for instance. We have. I mean, it's going back into public ownership now, thank goodness. But
I agree with that.
Yeah, but I think, we had train companies that were owned by Spanish companies and Italian companies, and I know you probably have a lot of love for the Spanish and the Italians, but they didn't do any work. Like, they didn't do shit to actually operate the train companies.
No, they didn't.
It was employed managers and administrators that were paid wages higher than frontline employees. But that's you have the exact same system in the Soviet Union, right? You have managers and administrators of huge state-owned enterprises, and you'd have the same thing in China.
Yeah, and I think that
doesn't justify a private appropriation. Sorry, I'm done now. Please continue.
And I was going to say, I do believe in things like public ownership of utility services, and I think that, especially for large industries, I think that there needs to be some degree of state control over those industries. I just don't think that. Removing the ability of somebody to privately own or operate businesses, I don't think that doing that is advantageous, simply because I think you've got to give people the ability to have aspiration. It's a bit like I don't believe in abolishing the idea of private landlords, but I do believe that there should be such a thing as
Why not?
I do believe that there should be such a thing as controls on the profits that are allowed to be taken from privately rented property. And it's for that same.
So I just wanted to challenge you on this one. So why keep private landlords? So what value do they objectively provide, like the housing sector?
Because if they weren't actually maintaining the properties, then somebody else would have to. The somebody else would have to be the state.
Yeah,
And
the
I
state.
think, yeah,
Why not the state?
because I think that in our current economic environment, I think that it would actually be, yeah, maybe in the long term, you might get to a situation where rented housing is all social housing. But I think that in the current environment we're in, if you were to say, well, we want to abolish private landlords and then the state is effectively the renter to everybody that rents, the issue I think that would cause is it would consume so many resources that the state could otherwise direct elsewhere. And I think that to get to a point where the state actually had that many resources to spare, or it had that much administrative capability, I don't think that's something that we could do in the short or medium term.
No, I disagree. I think privatization of housing has actually drowned local authorities in huge amounts of debt. They actually, local authorities now have to pay for enforcing imperfectly housing regulations instead of actually just providing the housing themselves and just adhering to those regulations as just a day-to-day operational thing. I'm really not convinced that the private provision of housing, it does either one of two things: either you ignore the enforcement mechanisms and you just you see the restoration of slums and slumlords, or you have to uphold tight enforcement regulations that are incredibly costly to local authorities. Whereas I think the obvious solution is the mass public provision of housing. I don't understand why we can't do this sooner rather than later.
I mean, I do believe in the public provision of housing. I do believe in social housing. And I do believe that the process by which new housing is built should actually be a lot easier and a lot quicker than it currently is. And I do think that there is a place for things such as rent controls, especially in larger cities where housing is unaffordable for many of the people that actually work there. So I do believe in a significant degree of state control over the provision of housing. And I think it's one of those situations where I can imagine that when you're at the point of actually um, running a government, from that point on, when you're talking about the creation of new towns or new housing estates, a much greater proportion of that would be built as socially provided housing, or housing which is specifically earmarked to be rented to people would probably just be rented as social housing, as in you wouldn't necessarily create new housing with the specific idea that somebody would buy it only to then immediately rent it to somebody else. And I suppose then the conversation has to be had as, well, how do you make sure that somebody doesn't do that? If somebody wants to buy a house, they can buy a house. But
Well, you just abolish buy to let.
well, yeah, you could abolish buy to let, but I think that it's one of those things where you have to look at what the housing situation is at the point where you're actually in government to be able to judge what the consequences of doing that would be. I think in an ideal world you wouldn't have buy to let. In an ideal world that wouldn't happen. But I think that the
Yeah,
world we're
like
in now.
we want to move to eradicate economic parasitism, and landlords are just that. They don't provide the housing. It's the builders that provide the housing, and the administration that can just easily be done by the state, right? It's already done to a large degree by housing associations, which are just mass housing administration bodies. That should really just be in one sweep nationalized. I cannot see any economic justification for private landlordism, especially now that we've seen that most quote unquote social housing or low income housing is managed by private housing associations. And I think you've even said yourself you want to see the private provision of housing curtailed. Well, why not just start there? We should just start by abolishing buy to let. So, you know, before we even get on to the private landlords that currently exist, just stop the proliferation of the private provision of housing.
I mean, I generally agree that there needs to be some kind of restriction on the creation of more of it. Um, whether it's economically feasible, to actually switch to a system where all rented housing is state rented. It's something which I could imagine could happen in 50 years or over a long period of time. But it wouldn't be feasible at the moment for the government to say buy all private housing and then immediately rent it. But
I
I mean,
disagree. I think our mutual hero, Colonel Gaddafi, went on economic campaigns that were far more ambitious than that.
well, he may well have done, and I think there were some things that Gaddafi did economically which were very, very beneficial to the people of Libya. I think that it's one of those policies where look, I think ultimately we do agree that more needs to be done to control rents and that more needs to be done to prevent housing from becoming unaffordable. And we both seem to agree that extortive rental practices through private landlordism should be curtailed. I disagree that it necessitates eliminating private landlordism, but where on my argument is that all it needs to do is ensure that people are not extracting exorbitant profits. Obviously, you disagree with that, but
yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on. I don't think we have quite enough time to delve into the minutia of the Holodomor Ukraine famine subject. I think that could be a subject for another day, as I'd like to have another conversation with you
fair enough.
at some time. And I am very grateful for your time.
It's likewise. Thank you very much.
I suppose we'll. What I'd like to do is now talk about your dichotomy between individualism and collectivism, as that was the common ground that you originally approached me with. That we differ in the methods of how we achieve a collectivist society. That's not really my words so much; it's really your words. But I just wanted to know what you meant by that.
I think because fundamentally, when it comes to collectivism and socialism, the question we then ask is, to us, what is the collective? Now, correct me if I'm wrong, through your prism, you see the world and you see that collective as being a class-based collective. Whereas I see collectivism through the prism of nationhood and ethnicity. I understand that class exists, but I think that's maybe where the difference is that your vision of collective is effectively workers of the world unite, the class collective, whereas I look at it as the national ethnic collective. I think that's where the difference is. But I think that when it comes to the fundamental idea of collectivism, we both fundamentally believe that the individual should ultimately be subordinated to what is the greater good of the collective mass, whatever we think the collective mass might be. And I think that's probably why many of our economic ideals are similar. They're not entirely the same, but I think that's why many of our economic ideals are similar.
Okay. I think there's I personally would think there's a false dichotomy really between collectivism and individualism. So within my own organization, I would I might lambast someone with individualist behavior who's behaving in a way of in terms of short-term individual gain at the at the detriment to
Yeah.
long-term collective gain. But it's it's the long-term collective gain that is the most individually enriching. As I always, as I believe that the way to the most to the happiest, the most meaningful life is dedicating yourself to the revolution, dedicating yourself to the liberation of the working class. Um, and that's why I know that when I die, I'm gonna die happy and have no regrets. And I hope your political activities give you that same feeling. Obviously, I disagree with your outlook, and I hope I do change your mind. You probably hope the same thing of me as well. Um, but I look forward to having further conversations with you. I've taken up enough of your time. Thank you very much for joining me. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah,
I'm
I
sure
have
the
as well.
audience, good. I'm sure the audience enjoyed it as well. And yeah, do you have any final remarks that you'd like to make to myself, our audience?
Well, look, firstly, thank you for inviting me on the show. Like I said, I think that fundamentally we are both people who recognise that the current political system is completely broken, and we both recognise that it does need to be radically changed, even if we disagree on what those changes should necessarily be. I think that the fact that we agree that the current system is broken puts us in a totally different category to the likes of Labour, Conservatives, Liberal Democrats, the Greens, Restore, Reform, all of these old parties of the system who fundamentally want to just preserve the current systemic status quo exactly how it is. They're just arguing over who should be in charge of it. And so I think that the common ground there is ultimately that we recognize there is something fundamentally broken with the system. It's not just that the issue is we're not the people in charge of it. And so, on that basis, I think it's been a productive conversation. I think your perspective on a couple of things was really interesting to hear, especially when you said at the end about, in your opinion, there is a lot of individual gain in dedicating yourself to a collective cause. I like that. I think that's very true. But it's been a pleasant evening, and thank you for the invite.
No, thanks for having this conversation with me, and we'll stay in touch for sure.
Yeah, no worries.
Take care.